The food that CEO bought for his children was perfect, expensive, and healthy, but they wouldn't touch it. He had the power to close billion-dollar deals, but he couldn't convince two children to take a single bite. In a busy cafeteria, he watched his authority as a father crumble in public, until a waitress, her shoes worn from a tiring shift, made something that wasn't on the menu. She didn't offer advice. She didn't tell a joke. She simply served them a different dish, and the change was immediate and shocking. What was there in that dish that the deluxe salmon didn't have? The answer is simpler and more powerful than you might think. But before we discover the secret behind Emily's gesture, and how a plate of pasta took her from a life of hard work to the center of Boston's most unlikely family, we want to know, which city are you watching from? And what's your favorite comfort food? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and let's discover this story together. The noise of a cafeteria at lunchtime is a particular symphony of chaos. For Emily, it was the music that ruled her days. The sound of stacked plates, the hiss of the espresso machine, orders shouted to the kitchen, and the constant murmur of dozens of overlapping conversations. She moved between the tables with practiced agility, a ballet of efficiency and balance, the heavy tray in one hand, the notepad in the other. Her feet, encased in the obligatory black shoes, were already protesting, even though the day was barely half over. But Emily had a gift, or perhaps a curse, depending on the day. She saw people, not just as customers, as requests for no onions or meat cooked medium rare. She saw the small stories unfolding at their tables, the quiet celebration of a couple, the tension of a business meeting, the loneliness of someone eating with a book as their only company. And on that gray Tuesday, her attention was captured by an island of silence amidst the noise. The table was in their section, near the window overlooking the busy street. At it sat twin siblings, a boy and a girl, who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. They were dressed with an elegance that clashed with the casual atmosphere of the cafe. The girl, Lily, wore a cream-colored wool coat, and the boy, Ethan, an expensive-looking turtleneck sweater. But their impeccable attire only served to emphasize their disheveled state. Before them, 2 plates of grilled salmon with vegetables, a healthy adult choice, remained virtually untouched. The fish was being torn apart into tiny flakes by the tip of Lily's fork, and Ethan's vegetables were pushed to the edge of the plate, a small wall against the world. They didn't speak, didn't look at each other. Their pale, serious faces were like mirrors reflecting the same image of desolation. Emily felt that familiar pang of empathy in her chest. Children often brought life and noise to any room. Their silence was unnatural, heavy. There was a sadness in their large dark eyes that seemed too ancient for such young faces. It was an absence, an empty space between them at the table that no amount of food could fill. She had already passed by their table 3 times. The first time to take their father's order, the second to deliver the plates, the third to refill the water, and each time the scene was the same, the children lost in their own world of melancholy, and the food growing cold, rejected. This wasn't the tantrum of a spoiled child. It was something deeper, a silent mourning that manifested itself in the refusal to nourish oneself, to participate in life. Their father, James, sat at the same table, but he might as well have been on another continent. An expensive laptop sat open in front of him, the screen glowing with charts and emails that seemed far more urgent and important than his children's silent grief. He was a man who exuded power, from the precise cut of his suit to the luxury watch on his wrist. But looking at him, Emily didn't see power. She saw a deep, frightening impotence. He spoke on the phone in a low voice, using impersonal business jargon, his eyes flicking over his children without really seeing them. He was there physically, fulfilling the role of present father who takes his children to lunch. But his mind, his soul were miles away, locked in a virtual conference room where he felt competent and in control. James felt the failure like a bitter taste in his mouth. He knew he should be talking to his children. He knew he should ask about school, about their friends, but every attempt resulted in monosyllables and that crushing silence. Since his wife's death, he no longer knew how to reach them. The bond that united them, the bridge between his logical world and their emotional world, had disappeared with her. Now he tried to fill the void with things. The best toys, the best clothes, the best schools. He gave them everything money could buy, hoping that somehow it would compensate for what he couldn't give, himself. The laptop was his escape, his refuge. In the world of work, problems had solutions. Goals were clear. Success was measurable. In his children's world, he was completely lost, a foreigner without a map and without knowing the language. Emily watched the scene from afar, from the service station where she filled water bottles. She saw the pent-up frustration on her father's face, the way he clenched his jaw after yet another failed attempt at interaction. And she saw the resignation in the children's small shoulders. It was a vicious cycle of disconnection. His distance fueled their sadness, and their sadness fueled his frustration and escape. An urge to intervene grew within her, an almost physical urge to break this painful pattern. But who was she? Just the waitress, a stranger. To intrude would be a breach of protocol, an invasion of privacy that could cost her her job. Prudence told her to step aside, to tend to her other tables, to avoid getting involved in a drama that wasn't hers. But then she saw a detail that broke her resistance. Little Lily, with her fork, pushed a broccoli off her plate and it fell to the floor. The girl stared at the fallen vegetable with complete apathy, completely unresponsive. And James, immersed in his call, didn't even notice. That little broccoli on the floor, ignored and rejected, became for Emily a symbol of the entire scene, a symbol of the nourishment that was being offered but not received, of the care that was present but not connected. In that instant, the decision was made. It wasn't a logical decision, but a decision of the heart. She couldn't fix their family, but perhaps she could make them eat. And sometimes, eating is the first step to starting to live again. She finished serving another table, and then walked purposefully toward the kitchen. She didn't go to the manager, but went straight to the chef, a temperamental man named Luis, with whom she had a relationship of mutual respect. "Luis," she said, "I need a favor. Off the menu." He looked at her impatiently. "I'm busy, Emily." "I know," she said, "but it's for 2 children at table 7. They haven't touched their food. They're upset. Can you make a really simple macaroni and cheese dish? The kind you make for your own daughter. Really creamy." Luis grumbled, complaining about the complication, but glanced over her shoulder to the distant table and saw the 2 small, silent figures. He sighed, a sound of defeat and pity. "5 minutes," he grunted, turning to grab a pan. As the pasta cooked, Emily returned to the table. This time she crouched down beside Lily's chair, bringing herself to eye level with the children. The movement caused James across the table to finally hang up the phone, his eyes narrowed and suspicious. "Hello again," Emily said softly, ignoring her father for a moment and focusing entirely on the twins. "I have an idea. I think this grown-up food is a bit too serious for a Tuesday. What do you guys think?" Her question was conspiratorial, as if she were sharing a secret. Ethan, who until then seemed oblivious to her existence, turned and looked at her for the first time. Lily said nothing, but a small crease of curiosity appeared between her eyebrows. Emily didn't wait for an answer. "I asked the chef to make a secret recipe. It's magical, but it's just for you guys." The word magic hung in the air. James watched the scene, a mixture of irritation and fascination. Who was this waitress to decide what his children should or shouldn't eat? He had chosen salmon because it was healthy, a responsible parenting decision. And now, this stranger was undermining his authority with promises of secret recipes. He was about to intervene to politely tell her it wasn't necessary, that he would take care of the situation, but he stopped himself, because for the first time in weeks, he saw a spark of genuine interest in his children's eyes. They were no longer staring into space, they were looking at Emily, suspended in her promise. And he realized that in that moment, she held more power and influence over them than he ever had. Emily returned from the kitchen carrying a single, large, deep plate. The scent wafting from it was simple, primal, and irresistibly comforting. The aroma of hot pasta, melted cheese, and a touch of butter. It wasn't a fancy dish. It wasn't decorated with parsley leaves or a French name. It was simply macaroni and cheese, a creamy, inviting yellow. She placed it in the center of the table, right between the 2 untouched salmon plates. "Chef Luis's secret recipe," she announced in a whisper. "He said it only works if you 2 eat together." She handed each of them a clean fork. The gesture was ceremonial, transforming a simple meal into a special event, a shared mission. Ethan and Lily stared at the plate. The vibrant color, the rising steam, the familiar smell. It was an antidote to the dull, gray food on their plates. Without a word, almost in unison, they picked up their forks. Ethan went first. He scooped up a small portion of pasta, the cheese stretching in a golden thread, and brought it to his mouth. His eyes closed for a moment. Lily watched him, then did the same. They began to eat, not enthusiastically at first, but with silent, methodical concentration, forkful after forkful. The sound of their small forks scraping gently against the plate was the loudest, most beautiful sound James had heard that day. It was the sound of surrender. Surrender to hunger, to comfort, to a small, simple pleasure amidst incomprehensible pain. Emily stood by the table, not like a waitress waiting to clear the plates, but like a silent guardian, watching her spell work. She didn't smile triumphantly. There was only a look of relief and tenderness on her face. She watched two children reconnect with one of life's most basic needs, and she felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. For her, this moment was the essence of her work, the reason she endured the long hours and the difficult customers. It was the opportunity to offer a small act of care that, for a brief moment, made someone's world a little less cold, a little more bearable. She knew the pasta wouldn't solve their problems, but it would fill their stomachs and perhaps a small corner of their hearts. James watched the scene, his laptop forgotten, the screen darkening from inactivity. He was paralyzed, witnessing a miracle on a small scale. He had tried everything: child therapists, Disneyland vacations, new iPads, all sorts of expensive distractions, and nothing had worked. Their grief was an impenetrable fortress. And now, a waitress, a complete stranger, had breached their defenses with nothing more than a plate of pasta. The realization hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. The problem wasn't their grief. It was his approach. He was trying to mend a wound in his soul with material solutions. He was applying business logic to the grief of his heart, and he was failing miserably. The pasta plate was nearly empty. The children ate slowly but steadily. And then something else happened. Lily took a forkful and, instead of putting it in her own mouth, extended it toward Ethan. He looked at her, surprised, and accepted it. A moment later, he did the same for her. They weren't just eating from the same plate. They were feeding each other. It was a gesture of complicity, of mutual care, a rekindling of the bond that grief had rendered dormant. They were remembering how to care for each other, an instinct that had been dimmed by the absence of their primary caregiver. And witnessing this, James felt the floodgates of his own pent-up grief begin to open. A single hot tear rolled down his cheek, and he quickly wiped it away, hoping no one had seen. But Emily saw. She saw the glint of tears on that powerful man's face and felt the weight of his grief. Their eyes met over the children's heads for a brief second, and in that look, a silent understanding passed between them. There was no judgment in her eyes, only quiet compassion. And in his, there was no longer distrust or irritation, but raw vulnerability, a silent plea for help. In that instant, they were no longer just a waitress and a customer. They were two people witnessing the fragility and resilience of the human spirit in the form of two children eating pasta. The outside world, with its demands and noises, disappeared. The entire universe seemed contained within that small table. As the last bit of pasta disappeared, a comfortable silence fell. It wasn't the heavy silence of before, but a silence of satisfaction. The children's cheeks were a little flushed, and the pallor of their faces had faded. "Was it good?" Emily asked softly. Lily nodded vigorously, a small smile with a trace of cheese at the corner of her mouth. Ethan gave a small, solemn nod, which, coming from him, was the equivalent of a thunderous compliment. "The secret recipe worked," Emily said, winking at them. Their little shared conspiracy had brought them together, creating an exclusive club that their father for now wasn't a part of. And James, watching, felt a pang of jealousy, but it was a good jealousy, a jealousy that motivated him to want to join that club rather than resent its existence. It was time for Emily to return to work. Other tables needed her attention. The reality of her shift was calling. "I have to go now, little chefs," she said, "but it was a pleasure cooking for you." The light in the children's eyes flickered at the prospect of her departure. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Lily asked, her voice small and filled with fragile hope. The question was a knife to Emily's heart. She couldn't promise. Her life was uncertain, her shifts changing. But before she could give a gentle, evasive answer, James stood. His move was decisive. He closed his laptop, the click symbolically ending his escape from work. He walked to the table, no longer a distant observer but an active participant. "Thank you," James said, his voice a little hoarse. He was speaking to Emily, but his eyes were on his children. "Thank you for everything." The everything encompassed much more than the pasta. It encompassed the attention, the care, the breaking of the spell. He took his wallet from his pocket, the automatic gesture of a man accustomed to paying for services. But he stopped. He looked at Emily's face, at her quiet dignity, and realized that offering money would be an insult, a desecration of the moment. He put the wallet away. "We owe you," he said, the simple phrase charged with profound meaning. He was admitting his need, his gratitude, his admiration. He was placing himself in a position of vulnerability, and in doing so, he reclaimed some of the power that truly mattered, the power of human connection. Emily just smiled. "Take care," she said, and with a final wave to the children, she turned and walked away, disappearing back into the frenetic pace of the cafeteria. Javier stood still for a moment, watching her go. Then he looked at his children. They were looking at him, for the first time that day, with an expression that was not of apathy, but of expectation. What would he do now? The stranger who had performed the miracle was gone. The responsibility was back in his hands. But something had fundamentally changed. He no longer felt helpless. Emily's demonstration hadn't diminished him. She had instructed him. She had given him a map, a recipe. It wasn't about the pasta. It was about seeing. And for the first time in a long time, Javier felt himself beginning to see again. The quest to heal his family, he realized, didn't require a trip around the world. It required only a journey of a few meters, from the head of his table to the hearts of his children. As Emily disappeared into the crowd of staff and customers, a silence fell over the table, but it was a different silence than the one that had preceded it. It wasn't heavy and oppressive, but thoughtful, filled with the echo of their recent connection. James looked at the two salmon dishes, now completely cold and grotesque in their pristine perfection, and then at the empty pasta dish between them, with only a few traces of cheese sauce. It was a perfect portrait of his fatherhood. He offered what he thought was the best, the most nutritious, the most correct, but what his children's hearts truly yearned for was something much simpler, something he had forgotten how to provide. He wasn't a bad father by intention. He was a bad father by ignorance, an ignorance born of privilege and pain, and that realization was somehow more devastating than simple malice. He felt like a man who owned an entire dictionary but had forgotten the alphabet. In a move that surprised even himself, he didn't call the waiter over for the check. Instead, he walked around the table and sat in the chair Emily had just vacated, which still seemed to hold some of her warmth. He was now beside the children, not at the head, not in opposition. He was physically occupying the space of connection. He looked at Ethan and Lily's faces, who were now staring at him with a new curiosity. He didn't know what question to ask, what topic to broach. His mind, so adept at navigating complex negotiations, was completely blank. So he began with the only thing they now had in common, the only success of that afternoon. "So," he said, his voice a little hoarse, "was the pasta good?" The question was simple, almost ridiculous in its obviousness, but it was a start. It was a bridge, fragile and small, built on a plate of melted cheese. Lily, who normally would have simply nodded, responded with words. Yes, it had a lot of cheese, and it was warm. The sound of her voice, speaking directly to him about something positive, was so rare and so welcome that James felt a wave of gratitude for Emily that nearly choked him. Ethan, the more reserved one, added, "The chef's name is Luis." The information was delivered with the seriousness of someone sharing a state secret. James clung to that small interaction like a drowning man to a piece of wood. "Luis, huh? He seems like a good cook," he replied, trying to keep the conversation flowing. It wasn't a deep or revealing conversation, but it was a conversation. And for that small, fractured family, it represented a seismic breakthrough. For the first time in months, they were sharing an experience, however trivial, instead of just enduring each other's presence in silence. The drive back to the apartment atop a modern mirrored building was a study in contrasts. Normally, James would turn on the radio or make business calls using the sound to mask the uncomfortable silence emanating from the back seat. But this time, he left the car silent. And to his surprise, the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with small sounds. The sound of Lily humming a melody she'd made up. The sound of Ethan asking small questions about the passing buildings, and the sound of James answering. He didn't offer facts or lessons. He simply responded. He was practicing. Each question answered, each comment heard, was like lifting a small weight, exercising an emotional muscle that was dangerously atrophied. He was awkward, uncertain, but he was present. And somehow, the children seemed to sense the difference. As he entered the penthouse, the sight that normally filled him with quiet pride now struck him with a chill. The white walls, the polished concrete floor, the minimalist furniture by famous designers, everything looked like it belonged in an architecture catalog, not a children's home. There were no drawings pinned to the stainless steel refrigerator, no toys strewn across the living room floor. Everything was impeccably clean, orderly, and soulless. The house was a reflection of his life, aesthetically perfect but emotionally sterile. He remembered the mess Emily hadn't bothered to make, the cheese in the corner of Lily's mouth, the way she'd knelt on the dirty floor of the cafeteria, and he realized that life, real life, was inherently messy. He'd been trying to shield his children from the mess of grief, keeping everything neat and controlled, when what they perhaps needed most was exactly the opposite: permission to be messy, to feel, to live amid imperfection. That night, James committed an act of rebellion against his own routine. When the nanny, an efficient woman named Martha, announced that the children were ready for bed, James dismissed her early. "I'll take care of this today, Martha. Thank you." The surprise on the nanny's face was evident. He went to the twins' room, a space that felt more like a children's furniture showroom than a sanctuary. He sat between the two beds and, instead of giving them a quick kiss and leaving, he picked up a book. It was a book his wife used to read to them. Her voice was stiff at first, the reading mechanical, but then he remembered how she did it. The different voices for each character, the gestures. He tried to imitate. His imitation was a pale shadow of the original, but it was an effort. And when he finished, Lily was smiling in the dark. "You did the dragon voice wrong," she said. But it was funny, and James felt he had conquered the world. He couldn't get Emily out of his head. The image of her, kneeling on the floor offering him the noodles, was etched in his mind. It wasn't a romantic thought. Not yet. It was more like a scholar obsessed with an ancient text containing lost wisdom. He analyzed her every gesture, every word. How did she know exactly what to do? How did she achieve without apparent effort what he'd been trying and failing to do for an entire year? She possessed an emotional intelligence that made his business genius IQ seem like a useless, rudimentary skill. He felt an overwhelming need to find her again. It wasn't just gratitude. It was an almost professional need. He needed to understand her method. He needed to learn from her. She was the consultant he didn't know he needed for the most important project of his life, saving his own family. The harsh reality of his task hit him the next morning. How could he find a waitress named Emily in a city of millions? He didn't know her last name. He knew nothing about her except that she was kind, had a tired smile, and understood the secret language of sad children. The vastness of the city, which normally represented opportunity and power to him, now seemed an impersonal maze. He, a man who could track the movements of any competitor, who had access to databases and information networks, felt completely powerless to find a single person who had changed his perspective in a matter of minutes. The irony was overwhelming. He could move markets, but he couldn't find the one person who could teach him what truly mattered. Refusing to be defeated, he returned to the coffee shop the next day, during a quieter mid-afternoon. He felt awkward and out of place, sitting alone at a table, without the excuse of a meeting or lunch with his children. He waited for an opportunity and approached the manager, a hurried man with a thin mustache. "Excuse me," James began, feeling strangely shy. "I was here yesterday with my children. A waitress named Emily served us. She was exceptionally kind, and I wanted to extend a formal thank you." The excuse was thin, but it was the best he could come up with. The manager looked at him, a little suspicious. "Emily? Which one? We have Emily Carter and Emily Chen." James mentally cursed his lack of information. He described the woman, her hair, her smile. "Oh, Carter," the manager said. "Yes, she's great, but today is her day off." The information was both a breakthrough and a dead end. He now had a full name, Emily Carter. The name felt real, tangible. It made her a person, not just an anonymous angel. But the manager wouldn't give him any more information, citing the company's privacy policy. James understood, but the frustration was immense. He left her a generous tip in an envelope with a vague thank you note, but he knew that wasn't enough. He wanted to talk to her, not just leave a note. The search would become more complicated than he imagined. He would have to return, day after day, hoping to cross paths with her shift. The mission to find Emily became a side project in his life, one he pursued with a quiet determination that would surprise anyone who knew him only by his ruthless reputation in the business world. For almost a week, the routine repeated itself. James, on his way out of the office, would stop by the coffee shop. Sometimes he'd bring the twins, who now looked forward to it with a joy that warmed his heart. But Emily wasn't there. In her absence, James was forced to practice what he'd learned. He'd sit with Ethan and Lily and try to connect. He'd ask them about their drawings, listen to their fights on the playground, comment on the different types of cars that passed by on the street. The conversations were small, awkward, but genuine. He was relearning how to be a father, one step at a time, without the safety net of Emily's presence. Paradoxically, her absence was forcing him to become the father he wanted to be, the father she had inspired him to become. Emily, during her workdays, occasionally thought of those children and their tense, sad father. The envelope with the money and the thank you note surprised and touched her. It was a kind gesture. She used the money to buy a new book she'd wanted for ages, but she hadn't expected anything more. In her experience, moments of connection between such different worlds were like shooting stars, beautiful, rare, and destined to fade quickly. She had her own worries, rent to pay, a double shift on the weekend. The wealthy little family was just a sweet anecdote to tell herself on lonely nights, proof that kindness still existed, however fleeting. Their reunion, when it happened, was entirely serendipitous, proving that fate sometimes has a better sense of humor than any careful planning. It was a Thursday, and the children's nanny had called in sick that morning. James, in an act that would have been unthinkable a few weeks earlier, canceled his afternoon meetings to care for the children. Unsure of what to do with them, he took them to a small public park near his office, a place he barely knew existed. And there, sitting on a bench under a tree, reading during her lunch break, was Emily Carter. She was wearing her waitress uniform, but with her shoes beside her, her bare feet on the grass, and a peaceful expression on her face. Ethan saw her first. He stopped suddenly, the little toy car falling from his hand. "It's the macaroni lady," he whispered to Lily. Lily's face broke into a radiant smile. Before James could react, they both ran toward the bench, shouting her name. "Emily! Emily!" The joy in their voices was pure and infectious. Emily looked up from her book in surprise, and her face transformed when she saw them. She stood, arms open, and welcomed them in a warm hug, laughing as they both spoke simultaneously, telling him about their days, about her absence from the cafeteria, about the new ice cream flavor they had tried. James approached slowly, an involuntary smile on his own face. He felt like an intruder in this happy reunion, but a welcome one. The scene was so natural, so full of genuine affection that it confirmed everything he'd already suspected. Their connection to her was real and deep. He stopped a short distance away, simply watching, feeling a wave of relief and gratitude that was almost overwhelming. His frantic planned search had failed, but chance, or perhaps something more, had brought them together. In that neutral park environment, far from the customer-waitress dynamic, the interaction felt even more meaningful. "I've been trying to find you," James said when he finally approached, the confession slipping out before he could think of something more eloquent to say. Emily looked at him in surprise. "I went to the coffee shop every day." The admission of his effort, his persistence, told Emily more than any formal thank you could. It showed her that the impact of that encounter hadn't been just one-sided. He too had been touched, had been changed. "I had a few shift changes this week," she said simply, but a small blush colored her cheeks. The realization that this powerful man had spent his time searching for her was both embarrassing and deeply moving. They sat on the bench while the children played in the grass a safe distance away, and for the first time they truly talked, not as a customer and a waitress, but as two people. He asked about the book she was reading. She asked how the children were doing. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily. He found himself confessing his struggles as a father, his loneliness, and she, in turn, talked about her dreams, her distant family, the feeling of being invisible in a big city. He was struck by her insight, by her simple, unadorned wisdom. She didn't give advice. She just listened. And being heard, he realized, was a rare and precious gift. Time passed too quickly. The sun began to set, and it was time to go. James knew he couldn't leave this second meeting to chance. The fear of losing her again, of losing that source of warmth for his family, made him bold. "Emily," he said, his voice serious, "I know this will seem strange, and you have every right to say no, but I see the effect you have on them. They need someone like you in their lives, someone who truly sees them." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'd like to hire you, not as a babysitter, but as a friend, to spend a few hours with them each week. Take them to the park, to museums. I'd pay whatever it takes." The offer came out awkward, a cross between a business proposal and a personal appeal. Emily looked at him, then at the children, who were now running toward her, their cheeks flushed with exertion. The offer was tempting. The money would be more than she earned in a week of hard work, but her instincts warned her, being paid to be friends. The idea felt wrong, a commodification of the genuine connection they had. She was about to politely decline, to say it wasn't necessary, that she'd be happy to see them when chance allowed, but then she looked at James's face, and she didn't see a CEO trying to buy a solution. She saw a desperate father, a man humbly admitting he couldn't do it alone and that he needed help. He wasn't trying to replace her, he was trying to learn from her. "I accept," Emily said, and the relief on James's face was palpable. "But on one condition." He looked at her, ready to agree to anything. "I don't want your money to be your children's friend," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I'll do it for free. My condition is different." She looked from James to the children and back again. "The condition is that you come along, on every outing, on every visit. It's not me they need full-time. It's their father. I'll just help show them the way." Her condition took him by surprise. It wasn't a demand, it was a challenge, an invitation. She wasn't offering herself as a solution, but as a guide. And James, sensing the profound wisdom in that agreement, accepted. That pact, sealed on a park bench, was the true beginning of their journey to becoming a family. The first outing under the new agreement was a visit to the New England Aquarium. The atmosphere was different. Previously, James would have bought the tickets, guided the children through the exhibits with the efficiency of a project manager, and left at a predetermined time. But with Emily's condition, he was forced to slow down. He found himself kneeling on the floor next to Ethan, fascinated by the penguins that moved clumsily on land but with sublime grace in the water. He listened intently as Lily, holding Emily's hand, told him imaginary stories about the colorful fish that flitted about in the giant tank. Emily wasn't directing the scene. She simply created the space for it to happen. She asked open-ended questions, validated the children's observations, and, most importantly, looked at James, inviting him with her gaze to participate in the wonder, to see the world through their eyes. For the first time, James wasn't just providing an experience, he was living it. Emily subtly became the teacher James didn't know he needed. She never corrected him or gave him direct instructions on how to be a father. Instead, she modeled behavior. When Ethan was frustrated about not being able to see the sharks, instead of saying, "Don't cry," like James would, Emily would kneel down and say, "It's frustrating when you can't see them, isn't it? Let's just wait here a little bit. Maybe they'll show up." She taught James, through her actions, the language of emotional validation. He, a man trained to solve problems, began to learn the art of simply sitting with a feeling, without the need to immediately fix it. He was a diligent student, observing every interaction, absorbing every silent lesson, feeling simultaneously a fool for not knowing and a genius for finally learning. Little by little, the magic of their outings began to spill over into the walls of James's home. On a rainy Saturday, when a picnic in the park was canceled, the atmosphere of disappointment was palpable. Old James would have turned on the television or given the kids a new video game. But inspired by Emily, he made a suggestion that surprised everyone, including himself. "How about we make our own macaroni and cheese today?" The idea was met with thunderous enthusiasm. The kitchen, normally a pristine sanctuary used only by private chefs, became a battlefield of flour, grated cheese, and laughter. They made a glorious mess, and as they cleaned up together, the kitchen smelled not just of cheese, but of home. The house was finally accumulating the right kind of wealth, the wealth of happy, imperfect memories. The most profound transformation was the children's. The light began to return to their eyes permanently. Ethan, once so withdrawn, began showing James his drawings, explaining the complex worlds he created on paper. Lily, whose sadness was a constant haze, began humming around the house and initiating spontaneous hugs. The nightmares that often woke them in the middle of the night became increasingly rare. They were healing, not because the pain of their mother's loss had disappeared, but because they were learning that it was safe to feel joy again. They were discovering that their father, the pillar they thought they had lost to work and grief, was slowly returning to them. Emily's constant, gentle presence was the catalyst, but it was their father's genuine effort that sealed the healing. And inevitably, the nature of James and Emily's relationship began to change. The long afternoons in the park, the museum adventures, the rainy afternoons in the kitchen, all of this built a foundation of deep trust and intimacy. They didn't just talk about the children. He began to talk about the pressures of his job, about the loneliness at the top. She talked about her life, her simple dreams, her own losses. They discovered in each other an attentive listener, an understanding soul. The respect and admiration he felt for her blossomed into tender affection, and the gratitude and compassion she felt for him and his family began to deepen into something that felt very much like love. Their friendship became the fertile soil where a deeper feeling began to blossom, quietly and naturally. The turning point came on a Tuesday night, a call in the middle of the night. It was James, his voice tense with panic. Lily was running a high fever, delirious, and he didn't know what to do. His first reaction wasn't to call emergency services or the on-call pediatrician. It was to call Emily. She, with a calmness that instantly reassured him, walked him through the process. Take the temperature, use a cold washcloth, check for other symptoms. She stayed on the line with him until the fever began to break. In that moment, James realized the truth. Emily was no longer a guide or a family friend. She was his lifeline. She was the person he turned to in a crisis. She was, in every practical and emotional sense, part of his family. And the idea that she was in a small apartment across town, when her place was right here with them, suddenly became unbearable. The next day, after confirming that Lily was fine, just suffering from a flu, James knew what he needed to do. The current situation, with its scheduled meetings and polite goodbyes, had become an unsustainable fiction. Emily's presence in their lives was no longer a luxury or a lifeline. It was a fundamental necessity, like the air they breathed. He spent the entire day rehearsing what he would say, feeling the same nervousness he felt before a big investor presentation, but multiplied 1,000-fold. This was infinitely more important. This wasn't about a deal. This was about his life, his future, his children's happiness. He was about to make the riskiest and most important proposition of his life. He invited her to dinner in a quiet restaurant without the children. The atmosphere was charged with palpable anticipation. After a tense silence, he finally spoke. "Emily," he began, his voice serious and full of emotion. "What started as me trying to learn from you has become something completely different. You didn't just teach us to laugh again. You became the reason we laugh." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I know our worlds are different. I know I have no right to ask this, but I'm no longer asking for a friend for my children. I'm asking you to consider sharing a life with us, to let us be your family, because I love you, Emily. I've fallen in love with your strength, your kindness, your soul, and I can't imagine our lives without you in it anymore." Emily felt the world spin for a moment. She heard the words her heart longed to hear, but her mind had never dared hope. The journey that had begun with an act of compassion for two sad children had led her to this moment, to this crossroads. The fear was there, a cold whisper that spoke of their differences, of the complexity of becoming a mother to children who already had one, of the pressure of entering a world so different from her own. But when she looked at James's face, at the sincerity and vulnerability in his eyes, the fear dissipated. She saw a good man who had lost his way and was struggling to find his way back, and she thought of Ethan and Lily, and the love she felt for them was as fierce and real as any blood bond. The choice wasn't really a choice, it was destiny. "Yes," she whispered, tears flowing freely. "Yes, James, I love you too." Emily's move to James's house was less of a move and more of a return. As she brought her few boxes into the spacious apartment, it felt like the long, scattered puzzle pieces were finally falling into place. The first morning she woke up in that house, not as a guest or a friend, but as her home, was transformative. She awoke to the sound of the children's laughter, who had invaded her room to say good morning. And when James entered with a tray of coffee, the smile on his face was one of peace and happiness she had never seen before. In that moment, on that sunny morning, with the smell of coffee and the warm presence of the children, they officially became a family. The ghost of sadness still lingered, like all the pains of the past, but now it was balanced by a present joy and a promise of the future. Time solidified what their love had begun. The house became a reflection of their new dynamic. White walls were painted warm colors. Abstract artwork was interspersed with family portraits and Ethan's framed masterpieces. Impeccable order gave way to a comfortable and sometimes chaotic life. James learned the art of building bedsheet forts in the living room. Emily learned to navigate parent-teacher conferences at the children's elite school. They became a team, partners in every sense of the word, facing the challenges of parenthood, grief, and life with a united front, strengthened by mutual respect and a deep, quiet love. A year after that day in the park, the family was unrecognizable. James was no longer the ghost in his own home. He was the center of it, a present, loving, and fun father. The children had blossomed, their natural resilience nurtured by an environment of safety and unconditional love. And Emily, the humble waitress who felt invisible, had found her place, her voice, and a love greater than she had ever dreamed. She hadn't lost her identity by entering James's world. On the contrary, she had found it. She had healed them, and in the process, they had healed her of the loneliness and sense of not belonging that had plagued her for so long. And then, a new chapter of joy began. One quiet night, after putting the children to bed, Emily handed James a small box. Inside, a pair of white woolen baby shoes. The realization took a second to hit James, and when it did, his eyes filled with tears of pure happiness. She was pregnant. The news spread through the house like a wave of light. For James, it was the promise of a new beginning, a chance to be the father he now knew he was from day one. For Ethan and Lily, the idea of a new brother or sister was the ultimate proof that their family was not only restored, but was growing, becoming stronger and more complete. The cycle of grief was finally being replaced by a cycle of life. During Emily's pregnancy, James remembered a dream she had shared with him in one of their first conversations. The dream of one day having a place to help other children, those who weren't fortunate enough to encounter an Emily along the way. He realized their journey couldn't end within the walls of their home. The compassion that had united them needed to be extended outward, as a legacy of the miracle they had experienced. He saw this as the perfect way to honor the memory of his late wife, while also celebrating the future he was building with Emily. It was a way to transform grief into purpose, gratitude into action. Together, they embarked on their most significant project. With James's business acumen and Emily's soul and empathy, they created the Aconchego Foundation. The goal was to create a daycare center for children from low-income families, a safe, educational, and above all, loving place. They found an old building and renovated it, not as an institution but as a large, colorful home. Emily, even with her growing belly, oversaw every detail, from selecting books in the library to preparing the kitchen menu, ensuring that every child who walked through its doors felt nourished in body and soul. The center would be affectionately nicknamed the Noodle Club by the children. Opening day was a celebration of community and hope. The venue was filled with laughing children, grateful parents, and inspired volunteers. Emily, radiant and just weeks away from giving birth, was the beating heart of the event, moving among the guests with a grace and warmth that drew everyone close. James stood by her side, not as the powerful CEO, but as the proud husband and co-founder, his face lit with a satisfaction no business had ever given him. Ethan and Lily, now experienced older siblings, acted as guides, showing their new friends the playroom and the best part, the kitchen, where the smell of macaroni and cheese had already become a tradition. Looking at it all, James had a moment of blinding clarity. He saw his wife, pregnant and happy, his son and daughter, now confident and generous, and the legacy of compassion they were building together. He realized that true success wasn't about what you accumulated, but what you distributed. It wasn't about the power you wielded, but the love you shared. His former self, the man who measured life in profits and losses, would seem alien to him now, a pitiful figure trapped in a gilded cage. He had lost an empire of solitude to gain a universe of connection. Months later, on a cold afternoon, the family was once again gathered in the original cafe. The place hadn't changed, but they had. The table was larger to accommodate the stroller where their new son slept peacefully. James, Emily, Ethan, and Lily were sharing a large plate of macaroni and cheese, a ritual that had become sacred to them. It was a pilgrimage of gratitude, a reminder of where it all began. The moment that had once represented the lowest point in their lives was now the foundation upon which all that was good had been built. Ethan, now an expressive 8-year-old, grabbed a napkin and a crayon Emily pulled from her bag. He began to draw. It wasn't a map of an imaginary place, but a portrait of his reality. He drew 5 stick figures holding hands: a tall man, a woman with a baby in her arms, a boy, and a girl. Above the drawing, he wrote in large, slightly crooked letters, "Us." He slid the napkin across the table for his parents to see. Emily took it, her eyes welling with tears, and tucked it into her wallet to frame later. James looked at the drawing, then at the faces of his family around the table. Emily's face, lit with a smile, Ethan and Lily's faces, now filled with a quiet assurance, and the sleeping face of his new son, a symbol of a future full of promise. The journey had been long and at times painful, but there at that table with the smell of melted cheese in the air, he understood the simplest and most profound truth of all. Life had broken him so that he could be rebuilt stronger and truer. He had to lose everything he thought mattered to finally find what truly mattered. And it all started there, with an act of kindness from a waitress and a plate of pasta. Emily didn't seek tips or praise. She simply saw the silent sadness of 2 children and offered the comfort of a plate of macaroni and cheese. And by kneeling beside that table, she not only fed 2 empty stomachs, she broke the spell of disconnection and taught a brilliant CEO that the most powerful solutions are sometimes the simplest. Often, our ability to solve complex problems blinds us to simpler truths, making us believe that the value of a gesture is measured by its cost. But James and Emily's journey teaches us that the cure for a broken heart isn't an expensive trip, but a warm plate of food served with genuine care. They remind us that the greatest healing plan isn't drawn up on a spreadsheet, but in the act of kneeling down to see the world from a child's perspective, and that the true measure of a father isn't the grandeur of his gifts, but the simplicity of his presence. If this story of empathy and simplicity touched your heart, as well as transformed the lives of James, Emily, and their noisy new family, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that remind us of what really matters. Seeing beyond appearances and listening with the soul.